Part 3, The Tide Turns. The offensives of 1942 had severely depleted the strength of both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, and morale on both sides was at a low point. Whilst Manstein was able to grasp victory from the jaws of defeat in the Third Battle of Kharkov, the months from March to July saw no action on the Eastern Front. German reserves and resources were almost empty, and Hitler knew he could not sustain the war for much longer if things did not change. The last chance for a German victory over the Soviet Union, at least as Hitler saw it, was one last enormous encirclement to finally cripple the Red Army. The rather obvious target for this attack was the enormous salient around Kursk. The Red Army planned to follow up the stunning success of Operation Little Saturn with a summer offensive, but Zhukov convinced Stalin to hold the offensive off, instead letting the Germans kill themselves at Kursk before counterattacking. To make sure that when the Germans attacked they would not break through, many defensive lines were dug around the Kursk salient, a massive undertaking, as the salient was almost 100 miles wide, a size comparable to Wales. Meanwhile, the Germans massed their forces, including their highly trained and well-equipped SS Panzer divisions. The vast majority of German infantry divisions were under strength. The Wehrmacht was almost at a 500,000 men deficit as of March, and so the heavy fighting would be left to the panzer divisions. By the start of July, the Wehrmacht had mustered 2,400 tanks and 500,000 men for the offensive. On the other side, the Soviets had dug 6 defensive lines, over 900,000 kilometers of trenches, and laid close to 1 million mines. As well as being dug in, the Red Army outnumbered the Germans in both tanks and men. On the night of July 4, British codebreakers intercepted reports of an incoming offensive at Kursk. They handed the information to the Soviets. It was discovered Operation Citadel would begin on the 5th of July 1943. The battle began with a preliminary Soviet bombardment. However, the German forces had been preparing for too long, and so this had little effect. In the skies, the German and Soviet air forces struggled for air superiority, a battle which the Soviets would eventually win. Since 1941 air superiority of the Eastern Front had been contested, but from 1943 onwards the Red Air Force started to gain dominance. On the ground, German sappers began clearing paths through the minefields for tanks to cross. Once the path was cleared, the heaviest tanks and most experienced units began to attack, overwhelming the Soviet defenses. The battle in the north raged all day, with the Germans having breached the first Soviet defensive line by nightfall. They had advanced almost 10 kilometers but had suffered heavy losses, with a large portion of their heavy tanks being disabled by mines and artillery. The attack was further stalled the next day when Soviet General Rokossovsky ordered an enormous countercharge, but by the evening the Germans were advancing again. Desperate fighting broke out in the town of Ponyry, as constant counterattacks from both sides led to severe losses, with the Germans describing it as mini Stalingrad. The German advances were further halted at the village of Olkovatka, and by July 10 the German offensive in the north had completely stalled. Meanwhile in the southern pincer, attacks began with a concentrated panzer attack. However, many heavy tanks were bogged down in the mud and minefields, and vicious Soviet tank attacks stalled progress on the flanks. By the end of July 5, the first Soviet defensive line had been broken in most places, but the attack was already losing momentum. German attacks continued on the 6th and 7th, breaking through the second Soviet defensive belt. The Soviet High Command was forced to move reserve troops forward, leaving the third defensive belt unmanned. The Soviets launched more armored counterattacks, but many were entirely eliminated by the Luftwaffe, the first time an armored force had been completely destroyed by an air attack in the history of warfare. By the 9th the Germans were crossing the River Sel, and the third Soviet defensive belt was threatened. On the evening of the 11th of July, German units had reached positions barely 3 kilometers away from the town of Prokhorovka. If a breakthrough was achieved, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps would be able to run amok behind the Soviet defensive lines, possibly leading to a collapse of the southern front. Soviet High Command could not let this happen, and thus an enormous Soviet tank counterattack was organized. On the 12th of July 1943, the infamous Battle of Prokhorovka began. Soviet tanks streamed down from the slopes around the town, crashing into the German heavy tanks. Fighting was at point-blank range. The German heavy tanks were in ideal conditions, where their superior guns and armor could be used to their full extent in the open fields. There was no cover, no tactics, simply the order, charge. Incinerated tanks lined the fields, charred black bodies lay strewn on the ground. Flesh fused with metal on the molten black earth. By the end of the day the Soviet charges had ceased, with 80 German tanks destroyed for the price of over 500 Soviet tanks. Yet despite holding their ground, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps had suffered enough damage for their advance to be halted. As Prokhorovka burned in the south, the Soviets launched Operation Kutuzov in the north, threatening Oral. Whilst the Germans held, any further advances were called off for the fear of encirclement. Whilst attacks in the south started again on the 14th of July, they achieved very little, and without heavy tank support they made little progress against the 3rd Defensive Line. Then, on July 17, 1943, the Western Allies landed in Sicily. As the majority of German forces were deployed at Kursk, the only option for the German High Command was to divert forces from the Battle of Kursk. This caused Operation Citadel, the German offensive, to end. It had been a decisive failure. But despite the cancellation of Citadel, the Battle of Kursk still raged. The Soviets regrouped and reinforced their beleaguered tank armies and prepared for a counteroffensive in August. These counterattacks began on August 3 as the Soviets crashed into the exhausted German troops. Through fierce fighting the Soviets pushed onwards, retaking Belgorod 3 days later. German resistance stiffened once Belgorod had fallen, but the Soviets still made progress. Casualties on both sides were very high, yet these were relatively minor compared to the coming months. On August 18, Oral was overrun, causing the collapse of the Oral salient. Then, on the 23rd of August 1943, the Soviets reached Kharkov. After heavy fighting, the city was recaptured for the final time. This would be the 4th Battle of Kharkov, but from August 1943 onwards the city was safely back under Soviet control. For days after the start of the Belgorod-Kharkov offensive, the Soviets launched Operation Suvorov in the north, with the objective of retaking Smolensk. The first phase of attacks faced unprecedented German resistance and was quickly bogged down, leading to a 3-week pause in fighting until the 21st of August. When the stalemate was finally broken, vicious fighting managed to push the Germans back, and the Soviets soon began gaining momentum. On September 25 Soviet units crossed the Dnieper and seized Smolensk in a night of desperate fighting. Since 1941, 93% of the city had been destroyed, but now the gateway to Moscow was firmly back in Soviet hands. After Smolensk fell, the attacks faltered and Operation Suvorov was called off. The Soviets had gained a large amount of territory at a high cost of men, but it was undoubtedly a great Soviet victory. At the very same time as Operation Suvorov in the north, the Red Army launched the Lower Dnieper offensive in the south. This was by far the most ambitious of the Soviet offensives up to this point. Its aim was to liberate all of eastern Ukraine, and hopefully create the chance to retake the western half as well. Exactly as in the north, progress was slow to begin with, but by late August momentum was gathering and the Germans were falling back. On September 15, after suffering heavy losses, the Germans began to withdraw to the Dnieper River, where a defensive line was set up. In effect, they gave up all of eastern Ukraine, but the Soviets were determined to take the opportunity and press the advantage. Unwilling to let the Germans reinforce the far river bank, the Soviets immediately began trying to cross the Dnieper. Some units were given boats, but many had to improvise rafts and floats to ford Europe's 4th biggest river. The Soviets were able to establish a few beachheads, though they were constantly threatened by unrelenting German counterattacks. German artillery and bombers were still in range to target any units crossing the river, meaning the divisions holding the lodgements were at between 25 and 50% strength. To try consolidate their positions, the Soviets launched an airborne attack on September 24. The attack was quickly scrapped together and was extremely haphazard, with many units missing their drop zones completely. As a result, the vast majority of the paratroopers were annihilated swiftly by superior German forces, both in the air and once they had landed. About half of the paratroops were able to form ad hoc groups, but only a few of these were able to get back to Soviet lines or link up with Ukrainian partisans. Despite the disaster of the airborne operation, the bridgeheads still held out. Once a larger number of Katyusha rocket launchers and tanks had arrived, the situation stabilized, and by October, 23 individual beachheads had been established. Eventually, the Soviets were able to link up the beachheads, but suffered heavy losses in the process. Once this had been achieved, the advance west halted, and focus shifted north to Kiev. Kiev was finally liberated on December 6 after 2 years of occupation. The historic capital of Ukraine had been devastated by the German occupation, and had been the site of many massacres, such as Babi Yar, the biggest mass shooting in the Holocaust. Immediately after the Soviet advance paused, the Germans began launching counterattacks. These were beaten back all throughout December, with the Germans achieving very little progress against the Soviet defenses. The Lower Dnieper offensive officially came to an end on December 23, 1943. The offensive was wildly successful, having pushed the Germans all the way out of eastern Ukraine, and liberating the symbolic city of Kiev. This was all achieved at a high cost of men, but the Germans were suffering equally as bad. December heralded the third winter on the Eastern Front, but with the Soviets holding the initiative, there would be no pause in fighting. As a result, a new offensive was drawn up, one to rid the entirety of Ukraine from the Axis powers and bring the war back to the fascists. The offensive began the day after the previous had ended, on December 24. The exhausted and demoralized German troops were outgunned and outnumbered by the Soviets, who soon began pushing them back. The winter of 1943-44 was a lot milder than the previous two, but conditions remained poor due to a large amount of wet snowfall. Instead of freezing over, the ground turned into a quagmire, seriously hampering armor on both sides. By the start of 1944, the Soviets had pushed out of their beachheads and secured Kiev. By the end of January, 60,000 men had been trapped in the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket, and the Wehrmacht was in full retreat west. Conditions were dire inside the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket, and it seemed to both sides that the 60,000 men trapped would soon face the same fate as those trapped in Stalingrad. However, a breakout attempt was made by some units in February, saving almost half the personnel inside the pocket, at the price of the majority of their equipment. Despite the breakout, the Soviets kept rolling the Germans back throughout February. As the Soviets advanced through Ukraine, they discovered the ruins of villages razed and plundered by the Germans. The horrors perpetrated by the retreating Germans infuriated the Soviets, especially the Ukrainians in the Red Army. From now on, they would feel no mercy towards the enemy, and the need for liberation turned into a need for revenge. After 2 months of constant advance, the Soviet attacks finally faltered in late February. However, Soviet High Command immediately began planning a new offensive, to retake the entirety of Ukraine and threaten Romania. After a few weeks' pause, the Soviets attacked again in March, smashing into the German lines. The Germans were taken by surprise, and the 1st Panzer Army was encircled on March 28. 2 Panzer Corps were annihilated when Uman fell, and all along the front the fascists retreated. Once Hitler realized how dire the situation was, he authorized reinforcements from France to be sent eastwards, and gave permission for the 2nd SS Panzer Corps to break out the 1st Panzer Army. Whilst they had lost a large amount of their tanks, the 1st Panzer Army managed to break through the encirclement on March 30. April saw the liberation of the Crimean Peninsula, culminating in the evacuation of Sevastopol by German and Romanian forces in April. The city, which had been previously sieged by the Axis in 1942, was retaken on May 9. Despite failing to destroy the 1st Panzer Army, progress in Ukraine carried on steadily. On April 10, the 3rd Ukrainian Front retook Odessa, a city close to the Romanian border. This set up the Soviets for the future invasion of Romania. The Dnieper-Carpathian offensive ended in early May, 1944, having pushed the Axis powers almost entirely out of Ukraine and back into Romania and Poland. The offensive also cut off German Army Group North and South using the near-impassable Carpathian Mountains. the liberation of Ukraine came at an unbelievable human cost. Over 1 million Soviet men died for their homeland, but the Axis powers suffered barely half the number of casualties. At the very same time as the Dnieper Carpathian offensive in the south, the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive was launched in the north. Its objective was to fully relieve the now 800-day-old siege of Leningrad, and to push the Germans back towards Estonia. On January 27, 1944, Soviet forces occupied the outskirts of the great city, pushing back the Germans and finally lifting the siege. The city of Novgorod fell soon afterwards, and by February the Axis forces had begun retreating towards Estonia. Conditions inside Leningrad had slowly improved over time, and in 1943 a land route was even open to the city. However, February 1944 would be the first month the city saw a stop to the constant bombardment, starvation and death that had plagued Leningrad for over 2 years. After taking Leningrad, the Soviets pushed further into Finnish Karelia and Estonia. The tide was irreversibly turning against fascism, but Axis soldiers still fought fanatically and opposed every attack. With reinforcements from France being sent to the east in increasing numbers, Stalin began to become infuriated with the Western Allies' lack of action. The previous year, in a meeting at Tehran, Stalin had convinced Churchill and Roosevelt to open up a second front, to draw forces away from the east and lessen the Soviet burden. After months of planning, the Western Allies told Stalin the invasion of France would begin in June 1944. With this knowledge, he ordered his generals to begin planning another offensive to coincide with the Normandy landings. It was decided the summer 1944 offensive would be the liberation of Soviet Belorussia. From there the Soviets would push on to liberate Poland and finally Germany itself. 1944 would be the year the outcome of the war was confirmed, but there was still more dying to be done before victory could be achieved. The Red Army would bring death to Germany, to Berlin, to the Nazis and fascism. The price of the war must be paid, and it would be paid by those who started it, all those years ago.